Ladies and gentlemen, what you are about to hear challenges the very fabric of what we know, or think we know. It is a story that defies logic, a tale that scoffs at the bounds of possibility. We all believe we know the tragic saga of Bonnie and Clyde, two outlaws gunned down in a relentless hail of bullets on May 23rd, 1934. Their deaths were supposed to mark the end of a legend, their bodies riddled with gunfire as justice claimed its victory. But what if history got it wrong? What if one of them survived? What if after decades of silence, she stepped out from the shadows, ready to tell the real story? Her story. Tonight, you will hear the voice of a woman who claims to be Bonnie Parker, speaking for the first time in 40 years. She brings with her a tale of betrayal, survival, and secrets that were never meant to see the light of day. So, sit back and listen closely, for the truth, as they say, is stranger than fiction. The small, dimly lit room smelled of must and forgotten time. Dust motes swirled in the pale light streaming through half-drawn blinds. The ticking of an antique clock on the wall was the only sound as the journalist sat, fidgeting with the recorder in his hands. They glanced nervously at the door, the weight of what he were about to do pressing down like lead in his stomach. "She'll be here," said the fixer, a grizzled man who'd been tight-lipped about the arrangements. "Just keep your head, kid. Bonnie doesn't like jumpy people." Bonnie Parker. The name was legendary, synonymous with daring heists, doomed romance, and bloody tragedy. For nearly a century, the world believed her story had ended on that fateful day in 1934. In a storm of bullets that ripped through the car she shared with Clyde Barrow. But now, somehow, impossibly, she was alive. And she was ready to talk. The door creaked open and the journalist's breath hitched. In stepped a woman whose mere presence seemed to draw the air out of the room. She was older, her face lined with age and a life lived on the edge, but her sharp green eyes still burned with the same defiance captured in countless photographs. Her auburn hair, streaked with silver, was pulled back into a loose bun. She wore a simple dress and a trench coat that seemed to belong to another era. "Bonnie Parker," she said, her Texas drawl softened by time but unmistakable. She extended a hand and the journalist shook it, feeling the calluses on her palm, a testament to hard years. "I reckon you've got questions. Just remember, not all answers are easy to hear." The journalist nodded, his voice catching in his throat. I appreciate you agreeing to this. I'm here to tell your story, the real story." Bonnie chuckled softly, taking a seat across from them. "Real story? Honey, the truth's a funny thing. Folks think he know it, but most wouldn't recognize it if it hit him square in the jaw." The journalist pressed the record button, the faint whir of the tape spinning, breaking the silence. "Let's start at the end. The ambush on May 23rd, 1934. Everyone believes you and Clyde died that day in Louisiana, but you're here. How?" Bonnie's expression grew distant, her gaze fixed on something unseen. That day, the way it played out, wasn't what the history books tell you. See, we knew he were coming. Clyde, he had a way of reading people, figuring out his moves before he made them. We should have run, but we didn't. And that's because of me. She paused, taking a slow breath. "I made a deal." "A deal?" the journalist echoed, leaning forward. "With who?" Bonnie's lips curved into a wry smile. "That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Let's just say there were folks who had a vested interest in getting Clyde out of the picture. But me? I was useful. I had charm, a face people trusted. They offered me a way out, but it came at a price." The journalist's pulse quickened. "And the price?" Bonnie's smile faded. "A life for a life. They sent a girl who looked enough like me to fool the law. Poor thing never knew what hit her. When the bullets flew, she was in my seat. I was already gone. The room fell silent, the journalist struggling to process what he'd just heard. You mean that wasn't you in the car? Bonnie shook her head. Nope, but the world thought it was. They buried her in my name, and Clyde, well, he's where he belongs, but it wasn't the ending he deserved. I should have stood by him, but I didn't. That's my cross to bear. The journalist's hands trembled as he scribbled notes. What happened after? Where did you go? They had a plan for me, Bonnie replied, her tone bitter. New name, new life. I played my part, doing little jobs for them, nothing too flashy. But I kept my eyes open, ears to the ground. That's how I learned the truth. What truth? Bonnie leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. That he weren't helping me out of kindness. I was just another pawn on his board. And when pawns outlive their usefulness, well, let's just say, I've been running ever since. The journalist cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. If it's okay, I'd like to ask you some questions about your time with Clyde, about life on the run, things only you would know. Bonnie's lips twitched in a faint smile. Fire away, darling, but don't expect pretty answers. How did you and Clyde survive while hiding from the law? Were you mostly camping out? She nodded, her gaze distant. Mostly, yeah. The woods were safer than towns. Lawmen didn't much like crawling through the brush. We'd find a clearing, pitch a tarp, and keep watching shifts. Clyde, he could spot trouble a mile away. And when food ran low, we'd risk hitting a gas station or a small grocer. Never stayed too long in one spot. Wasn't it exhausting, constantly looking over your shoulder? The journalist pressed. Exhausting doesn't even begin to cover it, she said, her voice soft but firm. You learn to sleep light, eat quick, and trust no one. Even the animals spooked me sometimes. A twig snapping could sound like a shotgun cocking when you're running on nerves. What about money? He asked. How did you keep going? Bonnie chuckled darkly. Banks, mostly. Clyde was a mastermind with a getaway plan. But when we couldn't risk a bank, we'd take what we needed from wherever we could find it. Desperation doesn't leave room for niceties. And Clyde? The journalist ventured. What was he really like? Her expression softened for the briefest moment. He was complicated, smart as hell, loyal to a fault, and stubborn enough to take on the whole damn world. But he carried a lot of anger. Every heist, every escape was his way of flipping the bird to the people who broke him. And I loved him for it. The journalist's pen paused. Did you ever wish for a different life? Bonnie's gaze turned sharp, her tone resolute. Every damn day. But wishing doesn't change what's real. And real was running, hiding, and doing whatever it took to survive. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. The journalist felt as if he'd glimpsed a part of her soul, a soul forged in desperation, bound by loyalty, and scarred by choices she could never take back. The journalist felt a chill run down his spine. The woman before them wasn't just an outlaw. She was a survivor, hardened by betrayal and loss. And yet, there was a vulnerability in her eyes, a flicker of the young woman who dreamed of poetry and love before the world turned her into a legend. Why now? He asked. Why tell your story after all these years? Bonnie's smile returned, but it was tinged with sadness. Because every story deserves an ending. And mine, well, it's not what people think it is. But there's one thing you need to understand before we go any further. What's that? Her gaze locked onto his, unblinking. You might not like where this story's headed. The journalist swallowed hard, his curiosity warring with a growing sense of dread. They had come seeking the truth about Bonnie Parker, but he were beginning to wonder if he'd bitten off more than he could chew. The tape recorder whirred on, capturing every word, every moment, as the legend began to unravel the tale that history had never known. Bonnie leaned back in her chair, her fingers absently tracing the edge of the table. I didn't go straight into hiding after the ambush. They didn't let me. Not at first. Said I needed to prove my loyalty if I wanted to stay breathing. The journalist furrowed his brow. Loyalty to who? She gave him a long look, her green eyes calculating. It doesn't matter who. It matters what they made me do. They sent me to clean up their messes, tie up loose ends. I thought I was just buying time, earning my freedom. But every time I finished a job, there was another waiting for me. It became clear freedom wasn't part of the deal. What kind of jobs? He asked hesitantly. Bonnie's lips pressed into a thin line. Let's just say I wasn't knocking over gas stations anymore. They needed someone to do what no one else could, someone who'd already died in the eyes of the world. I became their ghost, a ghost who got her hands dirty. The journalist shifted uneasily in his seat. Are you saying you killed people for them? Her silence was answer enough. The weight of her confession hung heavy in the room, the air growing colder. How long? He pressed. How long did this go on? Bonnie let out a bitter laugh. Longer than I care to admit. Long enough to lose what little of myself I'd managed to hold on to. You know, it's funny. All my life, people called me a killer, a monster. But I wasn't, not then. Now I wonder if they were right all along. The journalist's pen stilled on the page. What made you stop? Her expression darkened. They pushed me too far. Sent me after someone I couldn't bring myself to hurt. That's when I realized I wasn't working for justice or survival. I was just a tool, a weapon in their hands. So I disappeared. Again. This time, for good. He leaned forward, his voice soft. Who was it? The person you couldn't hurt? Bonnie's jaw tightened, and for the first time, she looked away. Doesn't matter. What matters is what came after. You think running is easy? Think it's romantic, like in the movies? It ain't. It's hell. Always looking over your shoulder, never knowing who to trust. The journalist's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of her story. But if they're still out there, aren't you afraid they'll find you? Her smile was cold. Afraid? No, prepared. Always. The tape recorder clicked as it ran out of tape, the sudden silence jarring. Bonnie reached out and stopped the machine, her fingers lingering on the button. This is where most people would walk away, she said quietly. Where they'd decide they'd heard enough. But not you. You're going to stay. And you're going to hear the rest, whether you like it or not. The journalist swallowed hard, his pulse pounding in his ears. He'd come for the truth, and it was clear Bonnie Parker wasn't finished revealing it. Bonnie's fingers tightened around the edge of the table, her gaze narrowing as if summoning memories she had tried to bury. There's something you need to understand, she said. They didn't just own me. They owned everything I touched. Every person I cared about. That's how they controlled me. By making sure I had nowhere else to turn. The journalist shifted, the tension in the room growing thick. Did you ever try to get help? Tell someone what was happening? Bonnie let out a bitter laugh, her eyes gleaming with a dangerous light. Help? From who? The law? They'd have loved to parade me in front of the cameras again, even if it meant reopening my grave. Besides, anyone I told wouldn't have lived long enough to do anything about it. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. But I wasn't completely helpless. I started keeping records. Names, dates, places. Every dirty deal, every secret meeting. I thought maybe, just maybe, I could use it to buy my way out.
The journalist's pulse quickened. Do you still have them? The records?
Bonnie's lips curled into a grim smile. Oh, I have them. But they're not for you. Not yet. Why not? He pressed. Because, she said, her voice sharp as a knife, once you know what I know, there's no turning back. And the people I'm hiding from, they'd come for you too. The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on them both. The journalist felt the first stirrings of doubt, but he couldn't stop now. Not when he was so close to uncovering the truth. Tell me, he said, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. What happened to Clyde? To the others? Did they know about the deal you made? Bonnie's expression hardened, and for the first time, there was real pain in her eyes. Clyde didn't know. I made sure of that. He would have fought to the end, and they would have killed him anyway. I thought I was saving him by making that deal, but in the end, all I did was betray him. Her voice broke, and for a moment, the hardened outlaw disappeared, leaving behind a woman haunted by her choices. I see his face every night, hear his voice. Sometimes I think he's the only reason I'm still alive. Like I owe it to him to keep running, to make sure the people who did this to us don't win. The journalist's throat tightened. And the others? Bonnie shook her head. They're gone, all of them. Some died in shootouts, others disappeared like I did, but none of them got out clean. That's the curse of running with people like us. You either die a legend or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. The journalist leaned back in his chair, the enormity of her story sinking in. He had come looking for a tale of survival and redemption, but what he had found was something far darker. Bonnie Parker wasn't just an outlaw or a victim. She was a woman caught in a web of lies and betrayal, fighting to stay one step ahead of the shadows that pursued her. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more she wasn't telling him. Bonnie's voice softened as she continued, a melancholy air surrounding her. I've spent decades wondering what it would have been like to die back there in Louisiana, to let them bury me with Clyde. Sometimes I think it would have been easier than living with what I've done, but I couldn't give them that satisfaction. They didn't deserve to win. The journalist studied her, his pen hovering above the notepad. Do you think they're still looking for you? After all this time? Her lips curled into a bitter smile. Oh, they're looking. People like them never stop. But they're not my biggest concern anymore. He frowned, confused. Then who is? Bonnie leaned in, her green eyes locking onto his. You, she said bluntly. You think you can write this story and walk away? You don't understand what you've stumbled into. The journalist's breath hitched. What are you saying? I'm saying they'll come for you next, Bonnie replied, her voice cold and steady. The moment your name gets tied to mine, you become a loose end. Panic flickered across his face, but he quickly masked it. I'm just here to document the truth. I'm not involved in whatever this is. Bonnie's laughter was sharp and humorless. You don't get it. The truth doesn't matter to them. What matters is control. They'll kill to keep it. Then why tell me any of this? He demanded, his voice rising. Why drag me into your mess? She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small battered notebook, sliding it across the table. Because I'm tired of running, she said, and I need someone who can finish what I started. The journalist stared at the notebook, his hands trembling as he picked it up. Inside were names, dates, and details that could bring down powerful figures. But with that power came danger, a danger he couldn't ignore. What am I supposed to do with this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Bonnie stood, her expression resolute. Whatever you want. But know this, once you open that door, there's no going back. She turned and walked to the door, pausing to look back at him one last time. "You wanted the real story, didn't you? Well, now it's yours. Just be careful what you do with it." And with that, she was gone, leaving the journalist alone in the dimly lit room, the weight of her words and the notebook heavy in his hands. He glanced at the recorder, still running, and wondered if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. Outside, a shadow moved in the darkness, watching as Bonnie disappeared into the night. The game wasn't over. Not yet. And for the first time, the journalist understood that he was no longer just a spectator. He was part of the story now. This interview was conducted on October 3rd, 1974, just 2 days after Bonnie Parker's 64th birthday. The woman who claimed to be the real Bonnie Parker was never seen or heard from again. Strangely, neither was the young journalist who conducted the interview. Reports from that day are fragmented and contradictory. Witnesses claim to have seen the journalist entering the secluded building where the interview took place, but not leaving it. Despite an exhaustive search, neither his body nor any conclusive evidence of his fate was ever found. Months later, a battered tape recorder containing the full recording of the interview was discovered in a bus terminal locker in Houston, Texas. How it got there and who left it remains a mystery. Some say it was Bonnie herself, making one last effort to have her story heard. Others believe the tape's appearance was a warning from those who had hunted her for decades, a reminder of their reach. Who found the tape and the circumstances surrounding its discovery is a story for another day. But for now, the tape remains a haunting testament to an interview that should never have happened. A story that perhaps was never meant to be told.